Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's lecture. I will first quickly, briefly introduce Julius Wilm, our speaker tonight, and then we will hear his lecture that will for about 45 minutes, and then this will be followed by a Q&A. Julius Wilm is a postdoctoral researcher at Leipzig University's collaborative research center called Processes of Spatialization under Global Condition. Julius Wilm received his PhD in Anglo-American history from the University of Cologne and has taught and researched at universities in Denmark, Switzerland, and the United States. His current postdoctoral project, titled Nation, State, and Empire, Digital Explorations of a Combined Spatial Format in the U.S. West, 1863 to 1934, examines the impact of post-Civil War democratic reforms on colonization processes in the Western United States. Julius is interested in how expanded concepts of civil rights, which on a legal level claimed to include previously enslaved African Americans and previously disenfranchised indigenous peoples, altered the form of colonization. In 2019 and 20, just shortly before I joined the GHI in 2020, and also the German Society a year later, Julius was at the GHI in Washington as a Gerda Henkel postdoctoral fellow in digital history. So Julius, welcome back, at least virtually. We are very excited to have you today, and we're looking forward to your talk titled A German-American Revolutionary Takes Office, Karl Schurz and the Waning of African American Indigenous Rights in 1870s America. The floor is yours, Julius.
Thank you. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for the invitation. This is my first opportunity to discuss my research on Karl Schurz with a mostly American audience. I have been speaking to a few German audiences over the past year or so. I've also published a short piece that ruffled some feathers about Karl Schurz roughly a year and a half ago. I have been working on two longer English language articles and a German monograph. And the German monograph is the manuscript that's most finished. But I'm very much looking forward to your comments and questions on my presentation tonight, because I have just heard from the other side of the ocean so far. Okay. Yes. So as the headline of my talk suggests, I want to talk about Karl Schurz as a participant in negotiating African Americans and indigenous people's place in US society during the 1870s. Biographies and public tributes to this day understand Schurz as a pretty progressive force, quote, defender of liberty and friend of human rights, as the inscription on the statue in New York City's Morningside Park puts it. I argue that Schurz's role was more problematic. While previously, during the 1850s and 60s, as an abolitionist, and in the immediate years after the Civil War, he had been a proponent of legal equality for both African Americans and Native peoples. In the 1870s, he spearheaded a more exclusionary politics that nudged rhetorically to universalist conceptions, but promoted a shape of white supremacy. As a US senator, Schurz campaigned for ending the US government's support of African American civil rights in the South. And by the end of the 1870s, as the US Secretary of the Interior, he pushed Indian policy towards forced assimilation. The consequences of both of these political decisions, of course, were harrowing and reverberate to this very day. While I want to correct the record on Schurz, which I believe many tributes still get wrong, my interest in him relates strictly to the role in the narrowing of US democracy in the 1870s. and his role in curbing the existing potentials for more universalist society. I therefore speak a lot about politics and to a smaller extent about implemented policies. The personal ups and downs and other details of his biography and social life are not a part of my presentation. In the following, I will present an account of the evolution of Schurz from a proponent of equal rights to one of white supremacy. This account is narrated by his contemporary critics, mainly from the affected groups themselves. These voices have so far been missing, even in the existing critical historical studies. I apologize in advance for the large number of quotations. In my opinion, however, they are a necessary addition to give a balanced account of Karl Schurz's complex legacy. To give you a bit of a structure, I will begin by talking about Schurz's conceptions of equal citizenship during the 1850s and 1860s. From there, I will move on to his rejection of Reconstruction and African American equal rights as a US senator during the early 1870s. Lastly, I will talk about his endorsement of forced assimilation measures for Native peoples as US Secretary of the Interior. A brief biographical overview that is useful to keep in mind as a scaffold for this talk. As you can see, Karl Schurz was born in Liebla near Cologne in 1829. He won prominence in the course of the revolution or the failed revolution of 1848 and 1849, mainly as a student activist, but also as a soldier. He orchestrated a pretty spectacular prison break of his friend and Professor Gottfried Kinkel from Spandau Penitentiary in 1850. And this put him on the map as a recognizable name. He moved to the United States in 1852. Then in the second half of the 1850s, he gains prominence again as an abolitionist speaker in English and activist of the emerging Republican Party. During the US Civil War, he served first as ambassador to Spain, then as a general in the Union Army. After the Civil War, he is a journalist for a few years, is then elected US Senator from the state of Missouri. In 1869, stays in office till 1875. In 1877, he is named US Secretary of the Interior. He dies in New York City in 1906. And as you can see from this brief overview, the 1870s were the decade in which Karl Schurz arguably had the greatest impact directly on US politics because he held elected office. Before and after, he was a pretty well-known commentator, but his involvement in party politics really centered on this particular decade. In surviving speeches from the late 1850s, when Karl Schurz first becomes a well-known abolitionist, he praises the political system of the US as a form of realization of the principles of democratic popular sovereignty, for which he had already fought in Germany. But at the same time, he measures the country critically against these principles. And according to him, slavery not only violated the natural rights of the enslaved, but it also led to the accumulation of power by individuals, which threatened to invalidate the democratic constitutional order. So to quote a speech from September 1858. Popular sovereignty, in the true sense of the term, means the sovereignty of all individuals so organized to give a common expression to the collective will, limited only by the natural rights of individual man. Its foundation can be no other than the recognition of the equal rights of all men. It can be built upon no other presumption but that all men are free, and that no institution which contradicts this principle has of itself a right to exist. So this argument had two dimensions. On the one hand, the rights of the enslaved were being violated. On the other hand, though, this accumulation of power was also violating the democratic rights of white Northerners, was the argument presented here. This was, of course, in a way, a politically strong argument, because it was not an appeal just towards solidarity with the enslaved, but it was an argument that tried to appeal to the self-interest of white Northerners. In that sense, he was no modern anti-racist. He did not put the rights of the downtrodden at the center of his argument, but he presented a politically quite strong case at this time, because it could reach quite far. When the war breaks out, the South secedes, he develops this argument further still. And his argument now is that to win the war, the North really needs to win loyal citizens in the South, and it can do this by freeing the slaves. And this is the argument that Schurz presents well before Lincoln is willing to go that far. This argument, of course, has a strong political force at the time, because the country is at war. It also reveals a limitation of the conception of inequality, because the people being brutalized are actually not at the center of the argument. And so it tells you that presenting an argument that's solely based on the rights and the lives of enslaved African Americans did not seem sufficient to him at this time. Nevertheless, it is a politically strong case which he presents. It becomes even more apparent when you look at his arguments relating Native American people's rights, that this putting the state and state consolidation at the center of the argument is not just a politically savvy way of presenting an emancipatory argument, but it actually shapes the way in which he thinks about these things. So the Westliche Post, which is a newspaper that Karl Schurz edited together with Emil Pretorius, publishes an unsigned editorial. Both editors may have written it, but I'm quoting it because it seems to be in line with Karl Schurz's thinking. Quote, "It is obvious that sooner or later, the United States must indeed adopt a policy of complete subjugation towards the hitherto independent tribes. And the sooner they, meaning the tribes, lose their character as independent nations and are made subjects, that is, citizens of the United States, the better it will be for both the Indians themselves and for the Western states and territories." So again, coming from this idea about state consolidation, state expansion, Karl Schurz presents the argument that Native peoples don't have a right to exist as separate political units because they are too small, is his argument. But again, he is saying that Native people should join the United States as citizens, which is very far away from how expansion is in practice handled on the ground, because Native peoples do not have the rights of citizens well into the 20th century. So again, you have this a sort of dualism, an endorsement of equal rights, but it is part of this framework of state consolidation, which is at the center of the project. So in 1865, Karl Schurz is again a prominent voice for Reconstruction, and he publishes a much-read report at the time, which contradicts President Johnson, in that Karl Schurz argues there's absolutely a need for a strong Reconstruction. African American rights will not be respected in the South unless there is some federal force that forces people to, white people to accept a legal equality of Black people. And this in turn is necessary because freed former African American slaves will be loyal towards the Union government. So the way that you reunite the United States after the Civil War is build up Union loyalty by supporting African American civil rights in the South. Loyal citizens will bolt the former Confederacy back into the nation. In 1870, after being elected to the US Senate from Missouri the year before, he changes his mind. He is still elected as a supporter of Reconstruction, promises that the rights of freed African Americans are more important than considerations for amnesty towards former Confederates. In 1870, he starts supporting on a range of issues a return towards what he calls self-governance, but which means the US government should have no business in interfering in the South. So it starts off in his home state of Missouri. There's a bolting faction from the Republican Party, which wants an amnesty for former Confederates. He supports that group. He then calls for amnesties for the few Confederate elites, and it's really not substantial numbers of voters in the South who are excluded from the political process. They should have an amnesty. He opposes the Ku Klux Klan Act, which is a bill that seeks to clamp down on white supremacist violence against African American freemen, as well as carpetbaggers, meaning immigrants from the North, who were seen as supporters of the New Order. And then finally, and this goes to 1872, Karl Schurz supports a third-party run by the so-called liberal Republicans, and the liberal Republicans are calling for a proper end to the Reconstruction. Federal troops should just be pulled out. Civil rights are less important. And the argument that Karl Schurz presents for all of these small little steps is that the US government could win the loyalty of white Southerners by not alienating them through too much interference in the South. Quote, there had been disorders in the South. But some of us saw the danger, so also the danger of protecting the rights of a few at the expense of the many of a whole people. We thought that local self-government should be left to the control of these matters. We believe that the outrages were exaggerated and that the perpetrators could better be reached by an appeal to their nobler impulses. So if white Southerners would be less alienated from the US government by federal interference, the idea is, in the longer run, they would also accept African American participation in political and social life. One could call this a trickle-down theory of human freedom, in that by endowing white Southerners with a self-government free from federal interference, the freedom would trickle down, and as things went by, African Americans would also be able to participate better in social and political life. Now, in hindsight, this seems like a pretty wild theory, but some historians, such as, for example, Eric Foner, accept this stance by Carl Schurz on its face value, that this is a theory that he held. It may have been wrong, but this really explains why he changes his politics at the time. He's not against African American rights. He really is just seeking another way of getting there. Frederick Douglass's newspaper, New National Era, had a different opinion of this. And I quote, "Carl Schurz knows that they, meaning the Democrats, are today as bitterly hostile as ever to the 15th Amendment and the Civil Rights Bill. That this hostility manifests itself in the southern states in the shape of assassinations and the depredations of the Ku Klux Klan. No one doubts, if ever restored to power, they would have nothing more pressing to do than to repeal or otherwise modify all the guarantees of liberty and equal rights on which depend the peace and prosperity of the country." So contemporaries of Carl Schurz had a harder time believing this. And the reason I put in both Frederick Douglass and Ottilia Assing here is that they both served on the editorial. They were both editors of the New National Era. Ottilia Assing wrote some of these ideas to her sister in a letter before that. Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, said something very similar in a speech. And so there's been speculation in some of the Douglass literature who actually wrote these articles about Carl Schurz, but it's my sense that it's a shared sentiment. It certainly is a shared sentiment, I will say. But the exact words, whether it's Ottilia Assing, Frederick Douglass, or whether they edited each other's manuscripts, I don't really know. A similar viewpoint can also be found in the Louisianian, which is a radical Republican paper published in New Orleans by William G. Brown, African American editor, later becomes superintendent for public education. And Brown wrote, "The history of those southern states in which the old element has been placed in power furnishes indisputable evidence of the impolicy, the danger of remitting control of these states to men whose antecedents, education, proclivities, and surroundings compel them to repudiate the Negro as an equal in any sense, and to heap contempt and wrong on him at every turn." So this is obviously also speaking from experience from living in Louisiana and trying to build a Republican project, including African Americans down there at the time. In addition to this sort of trickle-down theory of human freedom, as I call it, Schurz presents some other arguments that actually seem to contradict the case, because they seem to deny the possibility that things could ever get better. So in connection with an actually unrelated bill, he makes a case about the US South, and I quote, "Show me a single instance in any tropical country where labor, when it was left free, did not exhibit a strong tendency to run into shiftlessness, and where practical attempts to organize labor did not run in the direction of slavery. You find none. And we shall have reason to congratulate ourselves if we succeed by prudent management in repressing its most violent symptoms and in securing to the South a tolerable state of order without giving to this government too dangerous a measure of arbitrary power." This, of course, contradicts the idea that things would at all get better for either African Americans or white people in the South. And historians have argued, Alison Clark Efford, for example, that the environment really is a stand-in for race. And I believe she's right, because I've also found other materials, particularly in German, where Schurz makes a direct connection from blood to ability to social worth. But just taking this on its face value, without the dimension of the unimplied racism, it already has some troubling conclusions, as William G. Brown pointed out in the Louisianian, decrying, quote, "the great misrepresentations and wild theories of Mr. Schurz, vagaries and nonsense, propositions self-contradicting and absurd. Because colored men possess as much intelligence, control as much wealth, and wield as much influence as any class in the free West India Islands." So this is where the background of Mr. Brown is particularly interesting, because William G. Brown had studied at some university, it's not clear where, had become a teacher in freed Louisiana, and was a part of the Republican Party that was starting to integrate schools under Reconstruction. Schools were starting to get integrated in 1868. And at the time of Brown writing this, he was preparing a run for state superintendent for public education, an office which he was elected to in the following year. And so just taking the description of the South as a place where people are violent by disposition and you can't really change anything, of course, must have felt like a punch in the stomach to somebody who's concerned with building up an education system in Louisiana, and particularly an integrated one for African Americans and white people alike. When these positions that I've just sketched out were put forward in the early 1870s, and Schurz tries to bring a ticket to success in 1872 by the liberal Republicans, which, among other things, was to end Reconstruction at once. That ticket fails against Grant, but the next president, Rutherford B. Hayes, is quite enthusiastic about Schurz, and the two discuss during the presidential run what should happen, and Schurz pressures him, you should pull out the last remaining troops from the South. The 1876 election is like a very close call. There's some talk about voter fraud, and eventually there's a settlement that ends the throws the election to Hayes with an understanding that Reconstruction will really be over. And Schurz becomes a part of the cabinet, and in the first weeks, he actually gets to vote on the end of Reconstruction and actually calls for an even faster ending than eventually is coming, because there's a commission in between pulling out the last troops from Louisiana and South Carolina. In the following decades, there's not so much change in Schurz's thinking about the question of self-determination and civil rights in the South, because his proposition is throughout the 80s, 90s, and even early 1900s that the self-determination of white Southerners is central, but they should facilitate some form of progress for African Americans. And from this reasoning follows an opposition to the Federal Elections Bill in 1890, which is a short-lived attempt to reimpose some federal oversight over elections in the South to stop the exclusion of African Americans. And in 1904, he puts forward a little more skeptical views as to the South, arguing that some white Southerners appear to aim for the, quote, establishment of some sort of semi-slavery, but he's still vehemently opposed against federal intervention, because he claims federal intervention will just make things worse. And so the only thing to do is to initiate a, quote, slow process of propitiating public sentiment in the South. So the only way of ever moving out of the total exclusion of African Americans from political life and at the bottom of society would be that white Southerners might change their attitude, but 30 years later, 30 years earlier, he had argued for the end of Reconstruction with precisely this this idea that, you know, white attitudes will change. They hadn't, and 30 years later, he still argues that a federal intervention will just make things worse. A similar viewpoint can also be found in the Native American policies that he formulates as U.S. Secretary of the Interior. And that his argument is white expansion interests in the West cannot be opposed by a democratic government. What a democratic government should do is regulate white expansion interests in such a way that native people will be harmed less, and in some way or form they will benefit in the end. And this is a quote. It's actually from a rather late piece of his statements on Indian affairs, but it encapsulates his ideas. Quote, "Philanthropists do not themselves believe, if they are sensible, that 25 years hence, millions of acres of valuable land will, in any part of this country, still be kept apart as Indian hunting grounds. The question is whether the Indians are to be exposed to the danger of hostile collisions and of being robbed of their lands in consequence, or whether they are to be induced by proper and fair means to sell that which, as long as they keep it, is of no advantage to anybody, but will, as soon as they part with it for a just compensation, will be a great advantage to themselves and the white neighbors alike." So again, the idea is that the takeover of what's left of the continent under native control is destiny, but the US government should pursue a policy that puts this in a way that is more humane towards native people. The policies he's advocating change slightly over time. Like the full program is only presented around 1879. He comes into office in 1877, but he immediately starts with calling for the establishment of Indian boarding schools. And the idea for which he finds support among military men is that if native youths would be taken away from the quote-unquote savage surroundings, they could be instilled with American norms, and that would individualize them, and that would lay the foundation for integrating native people as individuals into your society. But what's needed is a complete change of culture in his sense. In 1879, he submits a bill to Congress, or his aides do, that calls for the allotment of Indian reservations. And there had been bills like this before. What's new about this bill is that it's not only about privatizing the reservations, dividing them up into small private plots that are privately owned as sellable property, but also that after these parcels had been divided up among native people, the rest should be sold to white settlers. This is a pretty important change at the time, because before that, the idea was that these reservations would just stay in place. And there's quite a bit of controversy about this particular point. What's often misunderstood about his Native American policies is that he likes to present his case for how to do Indian affairs as a rebuttal of military methods, as he calls it. And he says, you know, what I'm proposing here is at least not the mass murder, which might else happen. And this is an argument that you can still find in biographies quite often, actually. And I think it's very simplistic. And the reason is, if you actually look at the hearings that were going on between the Interior Department and the army, they both agree that they have a part to play in facilitating the takeover of native lands for white settlers. And what there's clearly the thought that if this program is pursued, there should be less military violence, but also there is a willingness to call for violent compulsion and military force when he sees that's necessary. And for this, I would I'll give you a particularly dark example, I think. This is the same picture that was used for the invitation tonight. Shows Carl Schurz with a delegation of Colorado Utes in early 1880. And this is the result of a treaty negotiation, which had started because of a violent clash in Colorado in late September. And what happened was that there were 3 agencies with Ute natives in the area, and then one agency, warriors or the White River Utes felt antagonized by the local agent. The local agent felt antagonized by them, called the army in. The White River Utes gave notice to the army that this is treaty territory and you can't march in here, with lots of memories of massacres of native people. The White River Utes took the march of the army, which continued, as a sign that they would be attacked, and so they attacked first. And an army unit is attacked pretty badly. The Indian agency at White River is also attacked. All men are killed, and women are taken hostage. They're released after about 2 weeks after negotiations. White Coloradoans call for revenge. So there are newspapers that call for open genocide in the territory at this time. Schurz is from Washington, gets this news, sends out a special agent, and his take on this is, well, if there now is the pressure on the Utes that the Coloradoans are really threatening, we should use this to press, quote, for the discontinuance of the Utes' tribal existence. And the idea is that this pressure can be used to force the Utes to give up what was then roughly a third of Colorado, I believe, in the West. And that's what you see in that negotiation. Schurz sends out a general who says that give up, or you might get annihilated to all 3 youth groups, also the people who had nothing to do with this, and to force the surrender of fighters who had been implicated with the attack on the agency. Schurz decides to cut off the White River Utes' food rations in the middle of the winter. And this is roughly 900 or 1,000 people. And he writes to his agent, quote, "Perhaps the alternative of supplies if they yield, or starvation if they don't, may have a strong effect." And this comes out in November of 1879. In January, newspapers in the East picked this up. And so it's, of course, been going on for more than 2 months at this time. And the Washington Post's editors wrote, quote, "If we can't catch the Ute murderers, we can starve their grandmothers to death. The Indian Bureau is brave. It holds on to food due to and paid for by these Indians and says to the old men, the women, and the babies, you can have something to eat when you have caught and surrendered 12 murderers. We ought to be a proud people." And at this time, a much more important paper was the New York Tribune, where Helen H. Jackson in Colorado Springs, a pretty well-known Indian reformer, wrote a piece that said, "Shall we sit still, warm and well-fed in our homes, while 500 women and children are slowly being starved in the bleak, barren wilderness of Colorado?" In response to this bad press, Schurz actually called together a group of reporters and tried to shift responsibility for the lack of rations, and claiming that the White River Utes had destroyed their rations and that there just wasn't enough food to go around, feeding the groups that had nothing to do with a previous massacre at the Indian Agency. This explanation is, however, not borne out by the previous letters that he had sent, where it's pretty clear that denying rations was a welcome leverage point over Native people, and there was no attempt to get more food out there. If you look at the demographic effect of the displacement of Colorado Utes between 1879 and 1882, which is when two groups have been forced out of Colorado into Utah, and the Southern Utes got like a smaller reservation in the south of Colorado. And you can see the population goes into a catastrophic decline. Of the White River Utes, almost 40%. 40% are not counted in the next census. I realize there are some roundings in this because the numbers are far too even, but it's pretty clear that there's a catastrophic loss of human life that results from this. And so when Hans Trefus, a Schurz biographer, writes about this, that the solution of the Colorado Utes affair was Schurz's greatest achievement. All of this is not there. That the great achievement was literally not survived by 30 to 40%, depending on the group. But going back to the larger policy, the Ute affair was presented in the annual reports as an example of where Indian affairs could go, namely that we actually succeeded in getting Native people to give up their tribal existence. And that just makes you question this whole idea that pressure and even mass violence would play no role at all in this. If the first example Schurz presented made so great use of it. And I can also talk about more examples, but I should probably move on from here. A lot of the legacy of the programs that Schurz is presenting in 1879, of course, fall into a later period. And the reason is the Carlisle barracks are opened in 1879, of course. So there is a boarding school, another one opens in Oregon, but the system isn't there yet. And the General Allotment Act, as it becomes known, is only passed in 1887. And with Schurz is out of office. But as you can see on this map, which is a map that I have drawn up, and all the green areas demark reservations that were open under the Allotment Act in, as you can see, much later decades, like 1910 comes up, 1909, 1895, and have a long legacy. At the time when Schurz was presenting this, he was a bit of a salesperson because he needed Congress to sign on to these policies, which he himself could not implement. Selling off reservations was not allowed under treaties, and so he needed the legislation. So he spent energy on trying to build a consensus for this. In 1879, he goes on a reservation tour with some of his friends and a New York Times reporter, and tries to get Native leaders on board for some of his ideas. And so he goes to what's now South Dakota, meets the Lakota, and there's a talk which Schurz attends, and he gets a pretty clear answer, I should say, to the idea from Brule Lakota leader named Spotted Tail. And I quote, his people, meaning the Brule Lakota, wanted to remain in the lands now in their possession and wanted the whites to be kept from encroaching upon them. When settled upon their farms, the Indians would rapidly increase in numbers and would need all the land which was set apart for their use, end quote. And so this, I think it's presentations at the time and even later accounts sometimes give the impression that Native people embraced property, right? And so they said yes to this program. And the way that I read this and other statements by Spotted Tail is that Western's concepts of property seemed worthwhile to experiment with, but absolutely not for opening up land for white people and getting Native people out of the way. So the perspective was a very different one, and it was about preserving Native communities and ways of life, and not opening up communities. So the travel group goes through several states, ends up in Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, and Schurz gives a speech, says, quote, when the secretary informed them that the government was not strong enough to resist the march of empire, they, meaning the leaders of the 5 civilized tribes, replied that a government which could crush a rebellion of 8 million of its people was certainly strong enough to prevent an unlawful invasion of the Indian Territory. So this idea that there's absolutely no nothing the US government could do of squatters just taking over, and so the only thing to do was to facilitate a takeover that was more friendly seemed ridiculous to people in Indian Territory. And the local newspaper then reported about, quote, disgust produced by Secretary Schurz's talk. The principal chief of the Cherokee, Dennis W. Bushyhead, some months later decides to write an article, which is eventually published in a New York newspaper called The Independent, which is a newspaper that Schurz had also written for previously. And Bushyhead really doesn't like this idea about privatization, and so he writes, quote, "There are those who wish us well, who are carried away by the doctrine of land and severalty. I would say to them that to provide that our land shall be a chattel that can be sold immediately or remotely is not the best way of civilizing Indians. In the Cherokee Nation, individual property rights are fully respected, but the right is in the use. Cannot you leave us alone to try our plan while you are trying yours?" End quote. And Bushyhead's article really pushes a button with Schurz. Schurz has just left his secretary position, and then he's writing in the Westliche Post that, quote, "Bushyhead's comment is making the rounds in the press, the implication being drawn from the statement that Indians in general do not want to know about settlement on farm lots as individual property owners. But Bushyhead's concerns stem solely from the fact that the intended, quote, dissolution of the tribal system, the state within the state, would cause ambitious politicians like Bushyhead to forfeit their glory." And I should just point out that this article appeared in German in Missouri, and Schurz made absolutely no effort to write to Mr. Bushyhead. And I think it kind of explains you like how these policies were presented and whose input had any value, that a policy as far-reaching as this, a selling of all native lands, gets a response in German, which the Cherokee have little way of reading about. How am I doing on time? Should probably get to an end.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. There are numerous white reformers as well, and there is a difference in radicalism certainly to be found. Helen H. Jackson is quite radical in that she suspects the whole allotment idea is just about benefiting white interests. There's also a reformer like Martha Liboron Goddard from Boston, who finds this idea about Indian boarding schools. On the one hand, she thinks the idea of Indian liberation, Indian education enticing. But she spoke to a general who was in charge of this, and then heard that native kids were being taken from the parents. And then she writes a letter to Schurz that argues that, quote, "the mass of children must, I think, be taught where they are and not separated from their families." And it's just she just heard what had went on, and the larger project of assimilating native people seemed rational and seemed understandable, but that step she would not take. Finally, a closing statement here, which I find quite sums up quite well the ideas that were presented at the time. And this is from John Beeson, who was an old Indian reformer from Oregon, who heard of a speech by Mr. Schurz and argues that his program, it will mean that the Indians must forfeit all which they hold sacred and dear from their ancestors, for the creeds and customs of those who have for generations debased and destroyed them. Far better for both races to take time and culture until the best of each can blend harmoniously in one great conglomeration. Now, some of these figures were not very influential, it's true. But the reason people are interested in the revolution of 1848 is also not that the Democratic side won, it lost. But the policies and the outlook of Schurz's critics maybe more may speak better to democratic ideals than actually Schurz's positions of the 1870s. Thank you.
Thank you, Julius. Can you just, oh, Bettina first,
I was
stop the
going to,
video?
yep.